I will be teaching the Honors Historiography Seminar next year, which is a full-year seminar for students in the Honors Program. I also happen to be the Honors Advisor. So if you're at all interested in learning more about the Honors Program, you can go through UVic as a history major, but you could also, if you want to kind of intensify your experience, you can go and do Honors. And basically, Honors involves writing a 30-page paper, primary sources, and then also you take this methodology seminar. So for students who are really into history and really like to do research, really like to do individual research, you can do your thesis on any topic that's of interest to you and work individually with a professor for a year to write that thesis. It's a pretty neat opportunity if you're kind of a history nerd and into that. So if you're all interested in learning more about the program, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. My email is sbeam@uvic.ca, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about the Honors Program. So that's just a general, since I'm here, general pitch. That's not what I'm going to be talking about, obviously. I'm going to be talking about torture. And I open with the excerpt from the 1984 United Nations Convention Against Torture because we'll be talking about the past, and we'll be focusing most of our time in the period of the Enlightenment and before. But I will be making connections with the past. So today's lecture is 1754 in Prussia, which was when Prussia abolished torture. So the overall theme is abolishing torture during the Enlightenment and why the practice continues today. So the Enlightenment is a really seminal turning point in the practice of torture. It's a moment when the West, when Western Europeans and then eventually North Americans as well, repudiated the practice of torture, that it was abusive and unlawful to torture people who were potential innocents, that is, the people accused of crimes but not yet convicted of crimes, to touch their body painfully in a physical way or to employ psychological techniques. This was deemed to be illegal and unlawful and abusive. So this is an important turning point in Western history, and that was affirmed in the post-World War II period when the United Nations came into being, and we see this protocol against torture being passed in 1984. But essentially really starting in 1948 with the foundation of the United Nations and the Geneva Protocols of 1951. There have been several reiterations of how torture is not a good thing. And I just put that definition up there for you because the U.S. right today, or U.S. government, some parts of the U.S. government, CIA for example, trying to argue what they were doing at Guantanamo Bay was not torture, but as you could see from that definition, if you took the time to read it, what they're doing is definitely torture. So that's part of the reason I gave that definition. So we'll be really focusing mostly on the 17th and 18th centuries, but I will be bringing it up right to the present to try and show you how history can show the ongoing challenges we face in human society. There is change through time. There are real changes. The Enlightenment moment of saying torture was illegal was a seminal moment. But we know that torture persists. So how and why does torture persist even though it's illegal? How could the U.S. justify using it in a war context, of course, against suspected terrorists, of course. But how can they possibly justify that when it's been illegal for several hundred years? So we will spend the bulk of the lecture looking at the pre-modern period, but then the last section will look at long-term outcomes of this making torture legal. And I guess the open question for today's lecture then is, what's the purpose of outlawing something if it continues? And my hope is that I convince you that outlawing it is an important first step, but it's certainly not a path to, it's not, doesn't mean something will be totally eradicated. So it's a first step, and it allows us to have dialogue about it, and it allows us to condemn states that use torture. It doesn't mean it immediately goes away, but without it being outlawed, you can do that. So I'll be talking then about the heyday of torture. Normally I have a slide that shows you the different sections. I'll be looking first at the heyday of torture, then we'll be looking at how torture declined, and then we'll be looking at how it's abolished, and then finally the fourth section of the lecture will be looking at modern challenges that we still face in the post-Enlightenment period. So our first section then is heyday of torture. So we tend to associate torture with the medieval period. We think of medieval torture and medieval punishments. But actually the heyday of torture in Europe was relatively late. So I'd say not very medieval practice. By that I mean that throughout, if you think of the medieval period as being a period, say roughly between 500 and most part, not using torture. The judicial system in the medieval period, on the one hand, relied on things like the ordeal, which is torture-like, but somewhat different, where God's hand was actually supposed to come down and determine whether a person had committed a crime. Someone was, an ordeal could be something like walking across a bed of burning coals and seeing if you didn't get burned. If you didn't get burned, then that was God saying you weren't guilty. But the ordeal wasn't actually used very much. It was highly exceptional, and most justice in the medieval period, up to about 1300, 1350, was accusatory rather than inquisitorial, and it was about resolving conflicts between two different parties. So if your husband was murdered, you as the wife could come forward, or the family of the man could come forward and demand restitution from the person who had committed the homicide. And the resolution of that conflict would be more likely to be a fine. The guilty party, if found guilty, would pay you a fine as sort of a way of making peace, kind of a peacemaking process. That characterized medieval justice much more than violent punishment. So punishments were usually fines in the early medieval period. This starts to change around 1300. Well, it's a long process. It's really just towards the very end of the medieval period that we see the rise of torture and execution on a much larger scale. So torture is enshrined in European law. It's a legal practice between the 13th and the 18th centuries. But as I say, its heyday is really between 1400 and 1600. The practice builds over a couple of centuries. We tend to associate torture also with the Inquisition, with religious church courts. The Inquisition was a church court that was searching out sin and heresy. And what is heresy? Beg your pardon? Heresy, who you're born into. No. I would love to say yes, but thank you for taking that risk. Anybody else? What is heresy? You're thinking about church court, religious court. What's a heretic? Yeah.
Maybe like going against the church and preaching against them.
Yeah. Someone else in the back? Do you want to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to say like going against the generally accepted viewpoint.
Yeah, going against the generally accepted viewpoint of the church. So anybody who practiced a form of Christianity, of course, we're looking at late medieval period, we're talking about Christians. Western Europe is Christian dominated. So people who go against the official church teachings and maybe are practicing a form of Christianity that they think is a valid form of Christianity, but the official church doesn't, they could be brought in by the Inquisition, questioned by the Inquisition, potentially tortured by the Inquisition, potentially punished by the Inquisition. So you can see on this image a wide variety of different punishments that the Inquisition engaged in. Some of them were just wearing a funny penitent like a robe over your clothes that had a cross on it saying, yeah, I sinned, I screwed up, but I'm doing penance, I'm making up for having committed those sins. Maybe they didn't say a particular prayer properly and they were willing to repent and correct themselves. But for unrepentant heretics, for unrepentant sinners who said, no, actually this form of Christianity that I practice, I think is the right one, I think you're wrong, I think the official church is wrong, and even out under torture to maintain that, say, no, I'm going to keep practicing my own personal version of Christianity. Well, then you risk potentially being executed. You can see secular authorities are preparing to burn these people at the stake. So we do associate torture with the Inquisition, and that's not incorrect. That is to say, torture first gets brought back into medieval legal practice through the church and through its church courts. So these Inquisitions, this is the Spanish Inquisition in particular, founded quite late in 1478. But Inquisitions start around 1200, searching at different groups that are potential heretics. So it does start with the church, but even in the case of the Spanish Inquisition, we should be aware that it was founded by the king and queen of Spain. So it's a church court, but the secular rulers of Spain were very much in favor of founding the Inquisition because they saw it as a tool of centralization. They saw it as a tool to try and discipline and control the local population. So there's definitely a state-building element to the founding of the Spanish Inquisition. And this is the point that I really want to emphasize. We don't want to completely say that torture has nothing to do with church courts, nothing to do with Inquisition. But most torture that occurred in Europe in this period when it was legal between the 13th and the 18th century was taken by secular courts, not by religious courts, not by church courts. They were out of secular courts of law in states that were modernizing and trying to monopolize violence. So we usually think of modernization and state centralization as a progressive historical move. That is to say, that the state, we're coming out of the medieval period, we're getting modern states that are organizing governments better and having a separate justice system and taxing more effectively. We tend to have kind of progressive narrative of the modernizing state. But another element of the modernizing state was the use of torture. As states started to modernize, to organize themselves more, they established more formal procedures for injustice, and they tended to rely on Roman law to try and organize the principles around which to organize their justice systems and their treatment of criminals. In doing so, because the Romans, so I had earlier in the slide that comes from Roman law. What do I mean by that? What Roman law am I talking about? When was the great moment for Rome? Today? Not so much, right? Maybe you might think of the Italian Renaissance as a time of greatness for Rome, but push further back into classical times, the period of classical Rome, classical Greece, when Rome became a huge empire and took over the whole Mediterranean, pushed as far as northern Britain, took over France and Spain. Rome was the center of a huge empire. So classical Rome, the classical Roman Empire, is when I'm talking about Roman law, I'm talking about the law of classical Rome. So it was what dates am I going to give you? I'll say, well, let's say it starts to really dominate the Mediterranean from about 150 BC to, in the West anyway, to about 500 CE. Okay, so this period, before the medieval period, so just before the medieval period, Rome was the important power in the Mediterranean. And these legal procedures that after 1350 European courts were using were drawn from this Roman tradition. They went back to a 6th century Roman law code, and that's where they learned about how the Romans had practiced torture. And they said, okay, we're going to adopt these rules, these laws that the Romans had developed, and use them for modern, because it was also modern, we don't think it's modern European practice. So secular law courts, secular states, legalized torture as a legitimate tool for trying to decide whether someone is guilty or innocent. And it peaks between 1400 and 1600 as these states really centralize and start to modernize. So torture is used to obtain a confession of guilt. It was not primarily a punitive practice. It was a practice that was used during the information gathering part of the trial. So if someone's accused of a crime, they're brought in for questioning, they're held in prison. You could argue that their being held in prison was kind of a form of torture too, because the spaces that they were being held in were often very, very uncomfortable, very cold, very hot, depending on, always hot and cold at the wrong time of year. And the conditions were very, very primitive. But when I say torture, I mean people being brought in for questioning explicitly about the nature of the crimes they may or may not have committed. This was torture was considered necessary because if you didn't have 2 eyewitnesses to a particular crime, then the only way to prove the guilt of the individual absolutely was to get a confession of guilt. So in this system of law, circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, was never enough to convict someone of a capital crime. So you can imagine a scenario of you've got a body that has a stab wound in it, the person's dead, you've got an individual who's covered in blood, who doesn't have an alibi, may have a weapon on him. But to be absolutely certain that that person is guilty, there had to have been 2 eyewitnesses saying, oh yeah, I watched Jack actually take the knife and stab Sally. Without those 2 eyewitnesses to sort of verify what actually happened, you needed to have a confession of guilt. So, and you can imagine there were lots of crimes in which there were not 2 eyewitnesses, and especially the witnesses had to be respectable people. They couldn't just be anybody off the street. They had to be respectable citizens, people who were considered to be honorable and honest. So if you didn't have those 2 witnesses, you almost, and it was a capital crime, a really serious crime, it was almost inevitable you might turn to torture to try, unless the person obviously immediately admitted their guilt right off the bat. But in doing so, they would know they would be executed, so there would be a strong motivation for them not to do that. So criminals are regularly tortured, and they're regularly tortured repeatedly. That is to say, somewhere between, as little as 1 time, or as many as 20 times. I don't have any evidence of people being tortured as they were sometimes in Abu Ghraib, over 150 times for a particular crime. But they could be tortured repeatedly, and that was legal. And this was a practice that varied very much significantly from court to court. So this is one technique that they used. They raised someone up on a pulley with the hands behind his back, and then would let him hang there and attach weights to his feet after he was lifted up, and the weights would be pulling him down. So this would dislocate the shoulders. So this was one of the forms of torture that was commonly used across Germany and in Italy, in Switzerland. Other kinds of torture included constricting the limbs. I don't know how well you can see these images. They're very busy images. But you can maybe see that there's a hammer here. And there's a guy who has a contraption on his leg. And the idea was to kind of compress the leg. And the hammer is being used to hammer in some splits that will increase the pressure on the leg. So again, something that caused incredible pain. And then here is the rack. So stretching out of people and eventually pouring water down their throats. So sort of early modern waterboarding, basically. So you feel like you're going to drown. And there was a specific number of liters of water that were to be, that wasn't liters, that wasn't the measurement they used then, but a specific number of measurements of water that they could use. So these techniques were very standardized. They became, there was obviously variation across Western Europe, but there were sort of, half dozen techniques that most states used. And the idea with these techniques was to cause incredible pain without, theoretically, doing long-term damage to the person. Because if the person refused to confess, they would be set free. So if you're able to resist confessing under torture, then you could be set free, or you could be given a much lesser punishment. So they might think you were sort of guilty. They might flog you, they might brand you, they might banish you, but you could get away with your life. So the idea was that you should be able to resume your life without being physically incapacitated. It was supposed to not break the skin. Torture was supposed to not break the skin, not cause lasting damage, just cause excruciating pain in the hopes that that pain would bring out the truth. However, people were aware that this didn't always work, that torture did not always produce truth. So we've got repeated torture sessions. There's a link, definitely a link between torture and execution. So the reason that people are being tortured is because they've committed what was considered to be a capital crime. So there's definitely a link between those two things. Sorry, I thought I had this slide. Oh yes, so on this slide, which shows the different techniques, it also gives a list of the wide range of crimes that you could be tortured for. So you wouldn't be tortured for stealing a bit of bread at the marketplace. You were only tortured for serious crimes that could result in capital punishment. And this is a list of some of the crimes that you could be tortured for. So murder, arson, banditry, treason. So it's crimes that really threaten the state, threaten civil order, threaten public order. But you could also be tortured for what we might consider sins or religious crimes, things that certainly in Canada today, you would be, and where, it wouldn't be a long prison sentence for adultery, sodomy, blasphemy, heresy, so speaking out against God, speaking about God in the wrong way, and witchcraft were all crimes for which you could be tortured. Okay, so it was a really critical aspect of the judicial system between 1400 and 1600. As I said, it doesn't mean that everybody who was accused of crime was tortured. In fact, the vast majority of people who were accused of crimes were mostly accused of things like petty theft, and so most of them were tortured. But it was a regular practice in all the secular temporal courts of Europe, continental Europe, not excluding England. England had a different judicial system, relied much on juries, and technically torture was not legal in England. But on continental Europe, so France, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Poland, Russia, all of these places, torture was a regular element of law. However, despite that, as early as the 15th century, that's to say right at the time that it becomes legal, Europeans expressed concerns about the practice. So it wasn't as if they were using this practice willy-nilly, lightly. They always took it seriously. It was always a matter of law. There were usually several judges involved in deciding whether or not to torture an individual for a particular crime. This was a serious matter. And they were aware, so this 13th century, there were concerns about torture being used abusively. So you see legislation saying, yes, use torture, do, because you need to get confessions of guilt, but be careful, don't use it abusively. It's possible to do that, and we want to make sure that, that we don't overuse our power. There are also real concerns about the truth value of confessions of torture. And this comes from the Roman tradition, so it comes from that classical Roman tradition. The Romans were also aware that people could lie under torture and were concerned about that. So it's a very long tradition in the West of being aware that torture doesn't always produce truth. But we find it tempting to use when the stakes are high enough. So just to sort of be aware that there were critiques early on, however, the practice was deemed so necessary in order to obtain confessions of guilt to be able to execute people that it persisted. Any questions about that? Okay, well, we'll have time for questions at the end, so. But please don't hesitate. If there's something that's not clear, especially if there's a term that I don't explain and you're really getting lost, please do let me know. Okay, because I don't want to have to wait till the end of the lecture for a basic term to be clarified. So the second section of the lecture is the decline of torture between 1600 and 1750. So this is a period before the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is an 18th century movement that happens in the 18th century. So we're looking at actually how torture declines before the Enlightenment. Torture is still legal throughout this period between 1600 and 1750, but the practice declines, even though it's legal. And this is actually the heart of my research. I'm interested in this period between about 1550 and about 1750, when torture is still legal, but the practice is declining. So for me, the research question is, why would a society that can legally use torture not use it? Imagine if torture was legal in Canada today. Do you think the police would use it? I think the police would use it. Maybe not. But that's the question for me, for my research, is why would a judicial system refrain from using torture when they can legally? So, all right. So why is there a decline in torture before the Enlightenment, or the critiques of the Enlightenment? There are a number of reasons. So the first one is there's less execution for sin, a desacralization of crime. What does that mean? Less execution for sin. So remember, I put up on the slide there that the crimes that you could be tortured for included crimes like adultery, sodomy. So that was considered, and that's the term that they used. That was how it was labeled. The word homosexual didn't exist, and yeah. So it meant basically anal penetration usually, although it could also mean bestiality. So sodomy was actually quite a wide set of crimes, and it could be, sometimes women could be accused of sodomy too, which is interesting. Okay, but anyway. So adultery, sodomy, so sexual crimes had been before 1600. You could be brought in, you could be tortured, you could be executed. For adultery, women were often drowned, their form of execution. Men were, if they were accused of sodomy, were often burned at the stake like a witch, because these crimes were considered to be so against God, breaking the marriage vow, committing unnatural sexual acts, that they had to be punished with violence. This conception that you have to execute people for having committed sexual acts or for having spoken out against God, heresy or blasphemy, starts to decline in the 17th century. So in the 17th century, by 1650, states are starting to pull back from those kinds of extreme punishments for sins. They were still prosecuting sins. There were still adultery cases, there were still sodomy cases, there were still blasphemy cases. People were still Christians. Most people thought that these acts were not a good Christian thing to do. But over time, the state no longer felt that it had to kill people over it. You know, they might just flog them instead, or they might just fine them. They would still punish them, they would still try them, but they no longer felt, states across Europe started to say, is this really our job? Or should it really be up to God to judge these people? After they die, God will judge them. If they've sinned, then he'll judge them. We don't need to do this ourselves. So a lot of historians talk about this as a kind of desacralization of crime. That is to say, crime is increasingly defined as crimes against public order, crimes against civil society, not moral crimes so much. there was still a Christian condemnation of these practices, but it's not a threat to the very fabric of society. So we're seeing over the early modern period between 1600 and 1750 kind of a privatization of religion, and the state no longer considered it so much to be their responsibility. So that's one reason. So that means that they're no longer executing people as witches. After 1700, we have very few witches who are being executed, for example. Very few people accused of blasphemy or adultery being executed. If you're not going to execute them, you don't need to torture them. Does that make sense? Why would you not need to torture them if you're not going to execute them? Why do you need to torture them? Why would you need to torture them? Yeah.
You're trying to torture them to get guilt out of, like, the guilt confession, so you're not going to torture an innocent person.
You're not going to, but they might think they're still guilty, but yes, you're on subject. So you're only going to, you're torturing someone to get a confession of guilt, yes.
Because you don't need the higher standard for conviction, so you don't need the confession.
Exactly. If you're just going to flog someone or just going to banish someone, you don't actually need to have that confession of guilt. You can just use circumstantial evidence. If you're going to execute someone, then you have to have that complete and full proof, and you have to have the confession of guilt. So once you decide you're not going to execute people for sin, you don't usually need to torture them either. They might come in and you think that they've committed adultery, and if there's enough circumstantial evidence, then you can convict them of a lesser punishment, like flogging or banishment, but you don't actually have to have that confession of guilt. So that's why when you stop executing for sin, you don't need to torture for those crimes either. Another reason that torture declines is a rise in elite sensibility and opposition to torture. So among the elites, among educated elites, we see a minority of people, admittedly, but a minority of people starting to speak out and write and publish treatises saying, wait a second, this practice is totally abusive and it's really not very effective, and it goes against our sense of what is decent and proper behavior. So we see elites becoming increasingly critical both of torture and execution rituals. So execution in this period happened in public. It was often with a large audience. You can see the scaffold. This is a British image, I have to admit, an 18th century British image. So the scaffold in the background where someone is, you can see the criminal. We brought the scaffold when he hanged. But there were always a huge public crowd for executions. And elites became concerned that the common people were getting too much pleasure out of these executions. That they were not being taught that crime is bad, but rather they were kind of getting excited by the violence of the state. So elites became much more concerned about the abuse of power and became kind of disgusted and found these execution rituals and torture rituals increasingly distasteful. They didn't want to be associated with them. So what we call this a rise in sensibility. So the elite sensibilities are starting to become more sensitive. I'm too refined a person to be. I would never be able to watch a torture. It would be so upsetting to me. I would faint. That would be sort of an elite kind of response that's saying perhaps we shouldn't be doing these things if they're so violent, sort of pulling back from violence. So that's another sort of reason that torture declines. Yes.
What do you mean by elite? Like,
Yeah, that's a great question. What do you think? Elite. Yeah.
Like a small amount of people?
A small amount of people? Yeah. Yeah.
people who were wealthier than the average person?
Yeah. I did use the term educated elite. So it would be a small proportion of the population, maybe 10 to 20% of the population. If you want to say basic literacy, then we're getting up to the 18th century, maybe 40% of the male population. So a minority of the population is more educated. Many of them are aware of the recent advances in the scientific revolution. They're the people who are most sort of tuned in to latest intellectual trends. Yeah? Is that helpful? Okay. All right. So we do see the concerns about the truth value of confessions leading to states passing laws that led to not the abolishment of torture, but its regulation. So as I mentioned, concerns about the truth value were, the Romans had concerns about the truth value, late medieval people had concerns about the truth value of torture confessions. But in the 16th century in particular, we see both Germany and France passing legislation outlawing the repeated use of torture. So both Germany, which was back then called the Holy Roman Empire. But we can think of it as basically Germany, Austria, writ large, Austria and Germany all together. So Central Europe. And also in France, in the 16th century, so in the 1500s, about 1550, passed legislation that says you can torture someone. Yes, it's a useful technique, but in order to assure that really they're telling the truth, we have to do two things. One is you might torture someone, but they have to agree to that confession the next day. So say you put them on the rack and they say, yes, I committed that murder. You have to put them in prison overnight and bring them back and not torture them the second day and say, do you maintain that confession or do you want to retract it? And only if they maintain it could it be used. Okay? So this is supposed to be kind of a safety measure to make sure they didn't just say something, oh, I'm in so much pain, I'll say anything, but that they're willing to uphold that confession the next day. And then, so as to avoid the circular abuse of you get tortured one day and you say, yes, I committed the murder, and then the next day you say, no, I didn't. So then, instead the judge is putting back on torture and doing it again, going through that process over and over again, of that maybe you confess it to torture, but the next day you deny it. These regulations that were passed by Germany and France said you should really only be torturing someone once. You could torture someone once. There was some wiggle room. If there was extra evidence that came in, then you could torture them again. But generally speaking, this legislation said you should really only be torturing someone once. So you can imagine, okay, can you imagine being in a court, being accused of a crime, and knowing that in the jurisdiction that you're in, you could be tortured if you've been accused of murder or arson, but you're only going to be tortured once. What's the likelihood that you're going to confess under torture? Beg your pardon?
And even if you do confess, you just say the next day that you didn't mean it.
Yeah, do people hear what she said? No. She said low, the chance of you confessing would be low, and then you could always say the next day, you could retract your confession the next day, and then they wouldn't be able to torture you again. So, and that's exactly what happens. People can resist torture. People don't automatically confess to everything when they are tortured. Once, if people know that their life's on the line, if they confess, yes, I committed this crime, I'm going to die for sure. If I can hold out, it's incredibly painful, but if I can hold out and say, no, I didn't do it, no, I didn't do it, if I'm only going to be tortured once, most people can do that. And I can say that because I've read hundreds of trials, and when people are tortured once, most people don't admit to the crime. It's when they're tortured twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and there seems to be no end in sight. They lose hope, and that's the point in which they literally say, I will say whatever you want. Just get it over with. Like, just kill me now. And I've seen many trials in which that happens. But once this legislation is passed, and once courts actually start applying these new laws, and that took about 50 to 100 years, depending on the jurisdiction, but once they really started torturing people just once, it was a useless technique, basically. It was really, confession rates of the Parlement of Paris were 5%. So why bother going through this huge rigmarole of having all this equipment, and it's expensive, right? It's expensive to pay someone who's been tortured for a long time if you're not going to actually get confessions of guilt. Yeah, question? Totally. Especially if it's a really shameful crime. Say it's you're accused of adultery, and you're a woman, and you have a really good reputation as a good person, like as a good wife and a good mother. That would be hugely important for a woman in that period. You might be very motivated to resist for all kinds of reasons, but honor would be one, your good reputation. Whether you've done it or not, right? So people are able to resist if they feel like the torture might end. We shouldn't think of torture as always producing a confession of guilt. So what happens is you try and regulate torture, you try and make it humane and not so abusive, and what you turn it into is essentially a useless interrogation technique. And so we see actually torture rates going down in places like Germany and France by 1700 because why bother? Why bother torturing them? Well, we know we can really legally only torture them once, and they're probably just going to deny it anyway. Yeah?
Like, if they held out and they didn't confess, were people seeing that as they're totally innocent, or did they see it as, oh, they just couldn't prove it, like they couldn't get a confession, but they did it anyway?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Sometimes they seem to have believed the person, and they let the person go. So sometimes if you hold out under torture, you could be completely freed, exonerated, pardoned, you know. Other times they were pretty convinced that they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, and they were pretty convinced that the person was guilty. And so then they would, if you held out against torture, they couldn't execute, but they could give you a lesser sentence. And that was basically a way of saying, we think you probably did do it, we can't entirely prove it though, right? So, so definitely. So they're very concerned about actually trying to prove the crimes. So torture becomes less useful because it's regulated, you can't use it in an abusive fashion, and so no one confesses. And then finally, the last sort of piece of the puzzle that explains its decline is a willingness by the 18th century, so by the 1700s, to convict based on circumstantial evidence alone. So we see this happening all over Western Europe in the 18th century, where people do start to be convicted even if they don't confess, based on circumstantial evidence, based on medical evidence. And this has to do with the rise of science and the rising confidence in physical evidence and medical evidence. They were calling in doctors to give evidence about, the state of a corpse. And the status of doctors was rising in the 18th century. Doctors hadn't been particularly well respected, barber surgeons especially. But by the 1700s, they're being taken more seriously. So we're actually seeing a shift in the law so that torture was less and less necessary to the judicial system. So it becomes less necessary and less useful. That is to say, when you do use it, you don't usually get a confession anyway. So those are some explanations for why the practice declines up to the period of 1750. Any questions about that? Okay, I appreciate those of you who are asking questions. So good. All right, so abolishing it. Okay, so abolishing torture during the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement that starts in the 17th century, but really flourishes and blossoms in the 18th century. So in the 1600s and the 1700s. So during the 17th century, we see an emerging discourse of human rights. People saying, actually, people innately possess certain human rights that cannot be violated. And this starts with religious toleration, people talking in the post-Reformation period about how we really should be able to tolerate and live side by side with different kinds of Christian groups without attacking one another. Someone like John Locke was very important in England advocating for that. But we also see it happening in places like the Netherlands. They established that religion was a private matter, that you could not be, at the beginning, sort of by 1600, they established that you could, whatever your private faith was, as long as you kept it private, the state really had no business in knowing what it was. There was an official state religion in the Netherlands. It was a Protestant version of Christianity. But as long as you were practicing it discreetly, whether it was Judaism or different forms of Christianity, they weren't going to go and prosecute you. They weren't going to persecute you. They were going to tolerate that there was religious diversity. So it starts with religious toleration, and then it starts then by 1700, people are looking more broadly at what kinds of rights do all people have within a society. Coming out of this Enlightenment movement, so this is an intellectual movement, it's an elite movement, so it's a minority of men, mostly men, educated men, university-educated men who are engaging in these debates. But by the 18th century, these ideas are being widely debated among an educated elite. So a minority of Europeans wouldn't even have been aware of these ideas, but they were the important, influential Europeans. They started talking about these ideas in coffee houses. They started meeting in coffee houses and in salons and debating ideas of human rights and what's the nature of society and how best can we improve society. So the Enlightenment movement was all about applying reason to try and improve human society. Let's use our reason, let's use logic and gather evidence to try and make human society as best as it possibly could be. So the goal was to try and improve and rationalize human society. So people were talking about these ideas in coffee houses and in salons, in Paris, in Berlin, in Vienna, in Rome, in Milan, all across Europe. So it's a European-wide intellectual movement. When I say salons, what's a salon? Yeah? Is that where people drink? They did drink. Yep, they did drink, and they drank in salons. Yeah, anybody else? But that's not all they did in Ceylon. Does anyone, okay, what does Ceylon mean? The word in French. Beg your pardon? So Salon means actually like a living room. It's a space within someone's home. So we often talk about the salon as the living room. Although back then it actually really meant more than bedroom. So salons were private parties that were given in people's private homes. But the point of them wasn't just to drink. There were parties where you did drink. But the point was to get together and discuss ideas. So, and this was, what's really important about salons is that men and women together discussed literature, discussed philosophy, discussed how to make society better. So it wasn't just men. Most of the treatises of the Enlightenment were written by men, but women of the elite, that is state, women who were nobles or women who were the upper middle class, who had some education, were engaging in these debates as well. So we're seeing the development of a sort of public opinion, a much more open public debate about things like how the government's run, how justice is run. And out of this, we see the emergence in the mid-18th century of attacks on the secrecy and violence of European justice. So Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment philosophers, sometimes we refer to them, like Voltaire or Cesare Beccaria, who was Italian, Voltaire was French, spoke up very boldly about religious toleration, but also about the judicial system. Cesare Beccaria is probably best known for his treatise against the justice system. So these were Enlightenment elite thinkers, not necessarily the richest people, they're intellectuals who were kind of on the margins of the elite, who were criticizing the way the justice system was run. Accusing the justice system, its use of torture, its excessive use of execution as being inherently tyrannical and abusive. So philosophers, let's say philosophers or men, intellectual men, started discussing these ideas across Europe, debating in particular the importance of having the rule of law, that a state should be run not by the arbitrary wishes and whims of a king, but according to law. That law should be really the thing that governs society, and the kings should be subject to law as well. So Voltaire, when we come to 1754, Voltaire, so this outspoken French philosopher, was actually invited to the court of Frederick the Great, who was king of Prussia for crucial several decades in the early 18th century. And Prussia emerged out of the Holy Roman Empire and became the kernel of modern Germany. So this is a northern Central European state that's emerging in the 18th century. And Prussia in the 18th century becomes a major power, emerges as a major military power under Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great was he's called the Great because he increased the sort of international prestige of Prussia and created it into a major power on the European military stage. But he was also a person who considered himself to be of the Enlightenment. He was very much aware of the current ideas that were floating around, and he wanted to see himself as an enlightened monarch. He wanted to be an enlightened king. He wanted to be a king. He wanted to rule absolutely. He didn't want to have a parliament. He didn't want democracy or anything like that. But he wanted to rule in accordance with the principles of the Enlightenment. So he invites Voltaire to his palace outside of Berlin, and they have long conversations, and Voltaire offers him advice on how to rationalize the state, modernize the state according to Enlightenment principles. So this is an image of Frederick the Great playing the flute at Sanssouci, which was his palace, at Potsdam, which is outside of Berlin. And his palace, the name of his house is Without Worries. He built this beautiful palace in the French style. He wanted very much to emulate the French. He thought the Germans were backward and behind. And so he made actually French the official language of his court. And he cultivated himself with the arts and music, played the flute. But at the same time, he also wanted to actually apply the Enlightenment to the way he ruled his government. And so it was in this spirit, and listening to the critiques of Voltaire about the justice system, that he decided in 1754 to abolish torture. So he abolished the practice of torture as part of the judicial process, that you could no longer torture someone who was not yet proven guilty. And this was part of an overhaul of the judicial system that culminated after his death in the Prussian Code of 1794. So this is a process that took several decades, but one of the early pieces that were put into practice was this abolition of torture. He felt this was a sort of a basic foundation, that you had to get rid of torture if you're going to have a fair judicial system. And then it took several decades for all of the judicial system to be reformed. So, so we see Frederick the Great taking a stand against torture and abolishing it. He was not alone, however. What we see happening over the next several decades is most European states abolishing torture. So Prussia in 1754 was the first major state. There were some minor ones that had abolished it earlier. Prussia was the first major state to abolish torture. We see Russia abolishing it in 1774, Austria in 1776, France in 1780, the Netherlands in 1798 during the French Revolution, and Spain a little bit later, also during the French Revolution after France invades and the Inquisition is dismantled. So we see over this period between, say, 1750 and the last states were like Portugal in the 1820s. So between 1750 and 1830, states across Europe abolished torture. They abolished torture, but interestingly, they do not abolish capital punishment. This was also advocated by people like Voltaire and Beccaria, that both torture and execution were abusive and tyrannical. But they abolished torture, but they don't abolish capital punishment. Why do you think they abolished torture, but not capital punishment? Yeah.
Capital punishment.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Yes. Capital punishment and execution, same thing. Right? Death penalty. All the same thing. Yeah.
Law was based on the Mosaic belief of eye for an eye, which is part of the Bible.
Okay, so we're looking at a Christian, these are still Christian states, even though we're looking at a desacralization of crime, these are still Christian states. Christianity comes out of a Hebraic Old Testament tradition in which we have this concept of an eye for an eye, okay?
Wouldn't it also be that they were just relying more on circumstantial evidence, that they still wanted the death penalty, but they just didn't need the confession to do it?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you've got the sort of Christian religious justification that execution is okay in a way, although there's also Christian critiques of execution. On the other hand, is they don't really need torture anymore. I mean, if you want to be really cynical, and it could be, Frederick the Great isn't going to be using torture very much anymore. It's not very useful. So why not? It's cheap. Yeah, we can abolish it. No problem. Yeah, we'll abolish torture. No problem. We'll use circumstantial evidence and we'll kill them anyway. And that's, I mean, I'm being a little overly cynical, but I don't think it's accidental that they abolished torture, which had become less and less useful and less necessary to the system. So it was kind of a cheap gift to the Enlightenment thinkers. But they weren't going to get rid of the death penalty because that was considered an essential tool of state. And that remains the case until really after World War II. It's only after World War II that we see the major Western European states abolishing the death penalty. But executions, the death penalty, capital punishment declined sharply all through the 19th and very rare in the 20th century, but it's not actually outlawed until after World War II. So they hold on to that essential tool of state. Torture has become less of an essential tool of state. So states abolished torture, but not capital punishment, because torture was no longer seen as an essential tool of statecraft. And I'm taking, on the one hand, I really believe in the principles of the Enlightenment, and I think they're absolutely critical. But we also have to balance that with an understanding that states don't always behave in moral ways, right? And their prime consideration is their own survival. And so I think this is what makes it so important that torture was abolished. But it also raises the specter of why it's so challenging to actually put that into practice. In the 18th century, and even today. So that brings me to the last section of the lecture, which is the persistence of the practice, despite the fact that it was outlawed. So outlawing torture mattered. It was important. It means that judicial systems in the West cannot torture their own citizens legally. I'm not saying that people aren't tortured in the West in prisons. It all depends on how you define torture. The UN is now increasingly labeling solitary confinement. It hasn't been officially adopted as part of their definition, but they're criticizing states that use solitary confinement because they consider, the United Nations increasingly considers solitary confinement to be an abusive practice, almost like torture. Canada, of course, practices solitary confinement, and there's a judicial review that's just came out quite recently that criticizes the use of solitary confinement in Canada, so far the Harper government has no interest in changing that practice. Whereas in Europe right now, they're really limiting the use of solitary confinement because increasingly there's an awareness that it's a form of torture, psychological torture. So ongoing torture results in penal systems that are officially torture-free, but it kind of depends on how you define torture, and it kind of depends on who you are. So judicial systems are never free of gender bias, of ethnic bias, of profiling. There's always that element. And if you're from a marginal group in society, say an Aboriginal group in Canada, you might be more vulnerable to abusive practice. It wouldn't necessarily fall under an official rubric of torture, but certainly might not be what the state likes to portray that it's doing. But it's important that we have that principle in place. If we find out that someone's being tortured, however we define that in the Canadian judicial system, we have legislation in place to combat that and to make it public and to embarrass the government and to try and change things, right? Because it's illegal. If it wasn't illegal, we wouldn't be able to do that. So it's very important that it is illegal. However, we have to acknowledge that it persists. It persists in various kinds of contexts, and it tends to persist against what I'm calling others, or what people call others. People who are not us but them, right? So however you define your group, whether it's religiously or ethnically or nationally, so not a citizen, hence can be treated differently. Not of your religious group, hence can be treated differently. So other ethnic, religious, and racial groups are often treated with less respect and less respect for human rights than people at home. So in the colonial context of European expansion between the 16th and the 20th centuries, when Europe actually comes to sort of dominate the world and takes over 84% of the world's territory by 1914, by the beginning of World War II, European nations politically controlled 84% of the world's territory, mostly as colonies. In those contexts, we know that torture continued to be used. But it also continues into the 20th century. So this is an example of a colonial context, of a 20th century colonial context. So Algeria, which is a state in North Africa, was a colony of France. So France was the colonial power in Algeria. But after World War II, as part of a general decolonization movement that was spreading across the world, Algeria wanted its independence. And France didn't want to let Algeria go. They had a considerable settler population, so white settler population in Algeria who were farming and also living in the cities. They wanted to hold on to Algeria, and they were willing to use violent methods to do so. In defiance of the Geneva Conventions of 1951, they refused to acknowledge what was going on in Algeria as a rebellion, as an official rebellion. Instead, defined it as civil disobedience. And as a result, they didn't have to acknowledge that the Algerians were enemy combatants. They didn't have to respect international law with regards to the treatment of criminals. And so we know that during the Algerian War of Independence, during the 1950s, that abuse of torture was practiced by the French on the Algerian rebels, but also sometimes by the Algerian rebels when they captured French, too. So it was a brutal, horrible war of independence. The French learned some of their techniques from the rebellions in Indochina or a little bit earlier. And it sparked a huge amount of debate in France in the 1950s. So people on the political left